Hello, I'm Alastair Hudson, and this is the introduction to the Derivatives Law course. I first published a book called The Law on Financial Derivatives back in 1996, and it's always intended to be a very practical book written for practitioners, but also a scholarly book analysing the law as it relates to financial derivatives markets and practice. So this course really grows out of that book, which is now, I think, in its 6th edition, probably soon to go into its 7th, talking to you now in 2013. It's an immensely practical course, but also raises, I think, some very interesting theoretical questions about the way in which derivatives markets function and how the law and regulation should interact with them. So I hope you will find this an incredibly practical course that will teach you things that it's very difficult indeed to learn about anywhere else. Look, no one wants you to know about any of the things I'm going to teach you, really. If you think about how derivatives markets have functioned since the early 1990s, it's always been a secret knowledge that a group of Illuminati have known. It's always been those financial market and financial law practitioners who've kept derivatives law really to themselves, a very small little area of knowledge. So the International Swaps and Derivatives Association Standard Market Agreements, which is a big bit of what we will be studying, these are the standard market contracts which are used around the world, not just in the UK, around the world for derivatives markets contracts. And the purpose of this course really is to teach you what derivatives are from a legal perspective, and to show you how that documentation works, how the law and derivatives interact. And this is one of the very, very few places in the world that you're going to be able to learn this material. So that's the real excitement of this law, and this really has been a situation in which we have tried through the financial markets to stop there being any regulation of derivatives. If you think about how this has worked over time, indeed chapter 15 of the latest edition of my book, The Law on Financial Derivatives, charts how from the late 1980s and the early 1990s, successive financial regulators in the USA tried to prevent, and really worked very hard lobbying politicians to prevent derivatives from being regulated at all. The idea was always that it would simply be a free market that would be allowed to innovate in its own way. And the thinking was that financial derivatives with their complex mathematics would be able to control risk. And that was always thought to be the beauty of derivatives. They could help you to speculate in financial markets, and they could remove risk. Now, of course, the financial crisis, which really hit home in the autumn of 2008, proves that all that was actually nonsense, that we couldn't simply expect that the maths was going to protect us from the possibility of risk in the future. And for the first time, public policy accepted that we needed to have regulation of financial markets. We needed to have regulation specifically of derivatives markets. And so this course is going to teach you about all of that hidden knowledge, that knowledge that a small coterie of financial law practitioners hold for themselves, about how the International Swaps and Derivatives Association documentation works. I'm going to teach you all of that, how the products work and everything else. And we will also, as this course moves on, and as the EU directives on derivatives regulations move in, as all the regulations are created and put into effect, we will look at how that functions too, and what the policy wars, in fact, have been behind that. Because it's at the very heart of what we think about free markets, and particularly financial markets, as to whether or not we think they should be allowed to innovate entirely on their own, whether or not there should be any control as to what's done on those financial markets, or whether or not we should regulate them. And actually, the question is not do we regulate or not. I think the question is, if we are going to regulate, in what way do we regulate? Because there's always something there to control. There's always the general law in the background of creating contracts. In that sense, derivatives perhaps have always been regulated in some loose way by the private law. But the regulation that's being proposed actually is very light for derivatives, I think. That's my own personal view, and the fun thing about this course, you do get to have your own view as well as understanding the technical material. Because the regulation that's being introduced at the EU level is only talking about providing information about transactions to private sector bodies. so that regulators will have an idea of what sort of business is being done in the marketplace. And it's talking about the need for those transactions to be cleared. Now, that's not completely invasive regulation, and as yet we're still not entirely clear what derivatives are going to be covered and not covered by those regulations. And what's fascinating about derivatives is that there has always been something slightly illicit about them. It's as though Pandora's box was opened. Because when they were first used in the late 70s and very early 80s, swaps, for example, were used to avoid exchange controls. When it was unlawful to move large amounts of money from one jurisdiction to another physically, what happened instead was, if I wanted to borrow money in Germany, I'd get a German company to borrow that money for me, so that I, as a UK entity, would be able to deal with that money in Germany. And reciprocally, I would borrow money in the UK so that the German company could use sterling. No money had to move across borders. Simply the two borrowers held those monies on trust, and they were literally swapped, in the sense that beneficial interest, the money in Germany, was swapped to me so I could beneficially become its owner, and vice versa. It's a very clever way of avoiding exchange controls. And in a sense, derivatives have always been creatively trying to get around problems. Now, it was always just assumed by Alan Greenspan and others from the Federal Reserve in New York that this would necessarily be for the public good, that markets would always seek to protect themselves and the rest of us by controlling risk. But actually, in practice, of course, we've created more hazard through derivatives markets. So it's a fascinating area of study. How do these constantly innovating, constantly creative derivatives markets interact with law, interact with regulation? One of the key things is to teach you practically how do we use derivatives law in practice.